Thank you, Jason. Before I proceed, I want to thank Olivia and Nikolai for giving us an opportunity to write a review paper about monitoring in muni markets. This is a topic that I'm super excited about and very close to my heart. You should know that this is the very first review paper that I've ever written in my life, and this is the very first presentation of a review paper that I've ever done, so be warned for any potential kinks. It's not my fault, I'm just learning. This is a recap of what we learned yesterday from the Muni presentations, right? This is not a small and not a peripheral market. There's a total of $4.4 trillion outstanding, finances the majority of the US infrastructure. Perhaps relevant to this conference, state and local governments operate about 5,000 pension systems with $6 trillion in assets. So that's an important market, and it's has very distinct institutional features that are going to shape sort of what is going on there from all perspectives, but especially from the monitoring perspectives. We'll make 5 conclusions in our paper. The overarching ones are that, well, this market is very different. It has agency problems being shaped by an absence of any residual claimant. Information environment is super opaque. And, the second overarching conclusion is that we simply just don't know enough. So I'm going to review what we know, make some wild assumptions sometimes, but you should be warned that, there's a lot of things that we don't understand. Well, the thing that is sort of clear, if you look at this market from like a bird's eye view, is that agency problems there are super complex. So I have this spider web emoji, which I was very proud to include in my slides, and I think that encapsulates the situation quite well. There is no clear residual claimant. Taxpayers have priority in some situations, and pensioners have priority in other situations, and then, of course, bondholders also have priority in some situations. It's very hard to understand. Now, another thing that is important about this market is that all those stakeholders also have competing incentives. So naturally, taxpayers want to lower their taxes, but no one wants to interrupt their services, so the balance must be made. Employees and retirees want to maximize the compensation and post-employment benefits, and bondholders, of course, face an asymmetric payoff function, so they mostly care about being repaid. So all of this means that there's no single performance metric like we have in corporate governance, for example, against which the officials can be judged. And on the top of everything, officials are going to have relatively short planning horizons because they're shaped by an electoral cycle. If we think about monitoring is not a hard problem to understand. It basically just has 4 main ingredients in terms of information, right? We need to be able to get the information. The information needs to be correct, verified by an external party, and then we must be able to understand what's being written here. And if we have disciplining mechanisms, that's also great. That ensures that we can actually do something about our local governments that would make them more fiscally healthy. So I'm going to follow this logic throughout most of my presentations throughout. So the first thing to know about information production and acquisition is that this market is very, very different from other markets. Due to 10th Amendment, which establishes federalism and gives all powers that are not given by the federal government to the states, no federal regulator can regulate local governments. Right? You cannot establish SEC or other organizations. They cannot establish disclosure rules the way they did in the private markets, and there's like explicit prohibition of doing so by not one, but two reinforcing regulations. Well, SEC tried to do something about it by introducing this rule, which basically regulates disclosure through underwriters. Underwriters must enter into contractual agreements with the issuers and ensure that the issuers provide continuing disclosure. Doesn't work super well, but that's kind of what we're facing right now. Now, in terms of what this regulatory regime results in, it's basically a very complex and hard to understand information environment. So annual reports span 150 to 300 pages. They're often written in a very hard to understand way. And then GASB, which is an organization that regulates accounting in this space, allows for some things that we're not familiar with in the corporate market. There's like dual perspectives in calculating some things. They can use the full accrual method, but sometimes they also use cash, which is called modified accrual. There's no single balance sheet we can look at. There's multiple funds that all have their own balance sheet. So this is just all to say it's very hard to digest. On top of everything, an average filing lag in this market is 280 days, so it takes almost a year for them to produce their reporting, which further complicates digesting this information. We don't know much about audits, so I will not spend a lot of time here. A couple of things that are worth highlighting is that only 20% of local governments have audit committees, so like some oversight function. Doesn't look very great to me. GASB, remember that's an accounting body that regulates reporting, allows for some things that are a little bit, that make auditors' life harder. For example, there's this GASB 61, means that auditors must verify that all the operations of the local government are presented fairly and kind of review the scope of operations. But it's very hard to do because there has been a proliferation of special districts, and sometimes they're hard to catch. CPA profession is in crisis, and accounting research would talk about it all the time, but it also started reflecting on local governments, which had a few of them had their ratings withdrawn because they couldn't provide information to rating agencies. Okay, now I'm just going to talk about the external monitoring agents that are going to use this information and try to discipline their issuers. It's a long list. Just to brag that we wrote a lot in this paper, I'm not going to talk about all those agents, but we'll highlight a few things that I think kind of stand out. So one of the important stakeholders here is taxpayers. They bear the consequences of the fiscal distress. They don't have a huge incentive to monitor, though, because information is hard to understand. So all of this kind of basically, the incentive to free ride is huge and rational. Sometimes when someone digests this information for them, they do take action. Usually it's just a media organization, so, some activists in the community. But generally, the monitoring is not so great. In terms of investors, as we learned yesterday, the majority of this market is held by retail investors. They face similar incentives in this market. One thing that also is worth noting is that this market is very illiquid, so even if I wanted to trade on an information that I somehow processed, the hurdle is pretty high. So the information signal must be significant enough for me to overcome this hurdle. For that reason, I think the signal that's contained in the price, it should ideally inform local officials about how they're doing too, is also quite noisy. Another important agent is credit rating agencies. A lot of retail investors just basically anchor on the ratings that are provided by credit rating agencies. They face some problems as well. They have a lot of capacity, but unfortunately, they also have their own agency issues, and oftentimes the changes in ratings are going to come after the bad news is already revealed. The important agent that deserves a standalone slide is the states. So the states have the sovereign power over their local governments, so theoretically they can regulate however they want. They can mandate disclosure, do all the things that they want to. They don't do that much. One thing that seems to be working is fiscal monitoring policies, where states regularly review the information that is provided by local governments to them. And here they have the regulatory capacity. They also have the incentive to prevent distress, because usually distress is contagious, so they want to kind of catch it early. And they also have the expertise of understanding financial statements. Is super important, because a lot of officials I came to believe are actually quite benevolent, is that they're just not sophisticated enough. They don't know how to understand their own financials. They don't know how to catch distress, and they don't know what to do about it. So when states provide this consulting service, it actually helps. Of course, here we also might face some frictions. State oversight can be political. Now, there is always an incentive for a state to help a little bit more the city that is governed by the same party as opposed to, the other party. This is a slide where I'm basically bragging that I read about all those cases. I'm not going to go through that, but I'm just going to make an observation that is also salient in the corporate market. So the blue things are basically the signals about those 3 bankruptcies. Those were the largest bankruptcies over the last 15 years, and each of them at the time was the largest ever. Right? There were a lot of signals available prior to the revelation of distress, but somehow, it did not help. So there were apparently monitoring failures all over the place. Another observation that I want to share with you is also, like in a corporate market, regulators are often playing 2 minutes? Okay, I'm almost done. Like in the corporate market, regulators are often playing catch-up. Right? There was this crisis in 1840s when 8 states in the territory of Florida defaulted because they borrowed way more than they could possibly sustain. That resulted in constitutional debt limits. But those only apply to general obligation debt. So, of course, there's an incentive to borrow with revenue obligations or other ways. That is going to bite in this crisis, and perhaps those crises. It wasn't fully resolved, but the debt market is here. Now, in the Great Depression, almost everybody who had a AAA or AA rating defaulted. That was not great, but they did provide some remediation regulation after that. However, that didn't resolve the problems that existed back then when ratings were super sticky and backward-looking. Right? There's still going to be a problem in a number of crises, even if today. Now, federal governments cannot regulate disclosure, we know that. Sometimes their efforts even backfire. After this initiative, we know that disclosure actually became worse. So basically, where I'm going to stop is just by summarizing and saying it's a very interesting market. Sometimes it makes my head explode, but most of the times I'm super excited about understanding how all this works. There's tons that we don't know about this market. So here are just some research questions that remain to be answered. Thank you.